I want to welcome you all. This is our April 2024 session of Community Health Learning Collective. So if you're new to this space, we're so happy to have you here with us in this Zoom room. CHLC is basically just a group that is centered on community health workers, promotoras de salud, CHRs, outreach folks, basically people doing work in community. So it's open to any, CHW and also any supervisor, ally, people who support and recognize the value that CHWs bring. So we get together once a month virtually to just share and learn together, grow together. So we feature a variety of different speakers and topics. Today, I'm very excited because we have Zoya Sirota from Trilogy, who's going to be giving us a MHAT training, mental health awareness training. So very excited and so much gratitude to Zoya. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, all. Hopefully, as Maureen sort of set y'all up, you're doing well, having nice weather, always a benefit, and just feeling pretty good coming towards the weekend. Let me get my screen share up here and we'll get ourselves started. Bear with me a second while I set all the nice, pretty things up. Okay, so in general, this space works best when you use it, right? I'm here to kind of support you all. We're going to talk about what we're going to cover in a second, but feel free to share your experiences. Let's consider this a safe space, a brave space to share, again, your own personal experiences, family experiences, experiences with clients. I'm here to kind of serve you as best as I can. So if you have questions, feel free to hop off mute and interrupt me. Use the raise hand, throw it in the chat. If I don't see it in the chat, which is very possible, it's a lot to manage, just shout it out, hop off mute. I want you guys to be able to use this space as best as it is for you, all right? So we're going to be talking about the things you're seeing on the slide today. What is mental health? What is mental disorder? How do we define these things? How do we approach them? We're going to talk a lot about stigma and barriers to care. So what prevents people from getting the help that they need? A little bit about signs and symptoms of some common mental health conditions that you all might be coming across in your work, in your personal life, in the community. A little bit about de-escalation. It's not a crisis-based training, but we will talk about when you come in contact with someone who's in a heightened state or having mental health symptoms, how can we approach them in a way that supports both them and ourselves? That's a great place to ask questions or to bring examples, to walk through examples. I know we have kind of a bigger room, and so being mindful of sharing that space, but it's always really practical to get into a nitty-gritty of something that actually happened, right? And then we're going to wrap up with talking about stress management and self-care and how we are all individuals who have mental health and need to take care of ourselves, how we do so, so on and so forth. Again, Maureen sort of set the stage, right? If you're not speaking, unmute, right? We've got a lot of folks, so we don't want any background noise kind of being distracting. But again, feel free to hop off and just chat, shoot at me, you raise your hand, all of those things. Like I said, safe and secure space. Mental health is a tough thing to talk about. Even if we are working in this field, it still can be really difficult. So let's have this space as confidential, as safe, as brave, supporting each other if we provide information or share stories, so on and so forth. And then just be present, right? I know it's easy to kind of multitask or do something else on the side. If you want to get something out of this session, it's going to be best, obviously, if you're present with us. Okay, let's jump in. I'd like to start with just asking you all, what is it that comes to mind when you think of mental health? What have you learned from family, from culture, from society, from movies, media, et cetera, et cetera? Anybody want to share out, whether that's in chat or balance? Yep, we got some diagnoses coming up on the screen: depression, anxiety, PTSD, neurodivergency. Absolutely, something kind of growing in our world. Well-being, yeah, that's a great one. Anyone else? Cool. Yeah, so great stuff. Oh, there's some more. Hey, whole person wellness. Ooh, I love that. And peace, self-care being important. Diagnosis doesn't define the person. That's wonderful. Yeah, great. Awesome. Thank you for getting those juices flowing this afternoon, especially like probably right after lunch when everybody wants to take a nap. So let's dive into it and talk about what is mental health. Mental health includes our emotional, our psychological, our social well-being. It affects how we think, how we feel, how we interact with the world, how we express ourselves, kind of affects literally everything we do. It also helps determine how we handle stress, how we relate to others, and how we make choices. As a lot of you cued in, mental health is important throughout the continuum of our life. From childhood, which there's so much more research in the past couple decades about mental health in children and how we need to differ what we're doing with children as opposed to adults, right? Mental health is important, especially in our adolescence and our young adulthood. Uh, as we age into adults and we're working in our societal functions, and then as we age into elderly or grandparents or individuals who are retired from the workforce, mental health then again really spikes and plays an important role in our well-being. For a baseline definition that we can all kind of grasp across the nation, right? The World Health Organization has defined mental health as a state of well-being in which someone can realize their own abilities, can cope with the normal stressors of life, can work productively, and or contribute to his or her community, to their community. So I'd like to hammer on that point a little bit because I think of like teenagers, their job, if you will, is to go to school, is to learn the social norms of the world, is to find their place, right? Single parents, their roles are to care for their children. So it's not necessarily working in the traditional 9 to 5, working productively. It's more of what you bring into the world and being able to do that to the best of your ability and manage any difficulties that may arise around that. It's important to note that mental health is typically viewed as a continuum, so ranging from having good mental health to having a mental disorder or a crisis, and all of us will vary along this continuum at different points in our lives. So that's mental health or mental well-being. What is mental disorder? So if mental health is functioning, is the way we see life, the way we feel and act, a mental disorder really starts to come into play when there are factors that are impairing our ability to do those things. So impairing our ability to function socially, to function educationally, to function work-related, so on and so forth. Mental disorders are characterized by alterations in thinking, mood, and behavior, just like our mental wellness is our thinking, mood, and behavior. But it's really that impaired functioning feature that I'm talking about. Also, in order to become a disorder, so a diagnosable disorder, we really need to think about pervasiveness and persistence. We can all wake up feeling sad for some reason or anxious about something that's coming up, but typically with the right supports, with our own coping skills, we're able to overcome that kind of human emotion. When we're starting to look at disorder or diagnosis, we're talking about an individual who cannot seem to get out of a depression or a sadness or constantly being anxious, and that it's a day in, day out experience for them that, again, per diagnosis or per diagnostic criteria, lasts for at least 2 straight weeks. I say all that to say I'm not encouraging anybody to go home and be armchair psychiatrists and start diagnosing everybody. Oh, you're anxious, you've got anxiety. Oh, you're depressed, you've got depression, right? We really want to take a look at that look of where it becomes problematic, when it becomes impaired, right? At the very bottom of the screen, what we're seeing common indicators or factors that contribute to the expression or manifestation of mental illness. So these can be biological, so our own inherent genetics, our neurochemistry, those kinds of things, life experiences like trauma, family history of mental illness, which does go back to the biological and having a genetic component, and also environmental factors, to name a few. There are many other things that influence, but environmental factors could be something like living in a war-torn country as a child or as an adolescent, or even as an adult, right? Or having those kind of more negative life experiences. On the flip, having positive life experiences are what we call PACEs. They're protective, especially in early childhood. If there is a biological predisposition, if there is a family history that might express mental illness, having those supportive, community-based, having a strong mentor or caregiver that someone can connect with, can act as a protective mechanism. And the same individual who may have, in a more negative environment, manifested mental illness may not. So there is some hope and there's some good things present there. Before I move on to talk to the continuum, is there anything not clear or anything I can expound upon around the kind of difference between what we call mental illness and mental disorder or illness, or mental wellness and mental illness?
Yeah, I like to kind of ask a question.
Yeah.
Um, so with this definition of mental illness or mental disorders, with the
Mhm.
example that you gave of like, for example, if someone's like growing up in like if someone grows up in like a negative, very traumatizing, household or living situation or environment,
Okay.
and they quote unquote come to be diagnosed with a mental illness, is it really a mental illness or just a rational response to their environment?
Great question, Kai. So yeah, we'll talk a lot about this in the next coming slides, right? In the West, we tend to pathologize what is mental illness, right? We really view it from a very medical, clinical lens. And mental illness, what we call, right, is honestly an expression of a maladaptive coping skill, if we kind of break it down, right? So let's take an easier example to digest for this situation. Someone who maybe ends up drinking or smoking weed at a very young age and developing a substance use trouble because they have had a very traumatic history. That begins as a coping mechanism for that individual. And so I hear what you're saying, that rational response to their situation makes a lot of sense. Now, we of course want to help individuals who are impaired in their functioning, right? Because at least I want to see everybody living a peaceful, a productive, a content, right? Not even productive, but like internally content life. And so this is why our field exists, why we try to support individuals in reaching that kind of self-actualization and feeling comfortable in their selves role. But I agree. To answer your question in a very long-winded way, yes, most mental disorder is an expression of a maladaptive coping skill. Was that helpful?
Yeah, well, I just kind of wanted to like tease out the pathologizing of just like
Yeah.
be like more rational responses. Thank you.
Yeah, we're gonna spend some more time talking about it, so I'm glad you brought it up. Okay. So I mentioned that we tend to
I have
think,
a
yeah,
question. Oh,
please.
I raised my hand. Maybe you didn't see the
Yeah,
hand.
yeah. You can just shout out at me.
So, oh no, no, no. I know to follow up on the previous question, similar to that, because I just wrote down maladaptive coping skill. I'm just gonna take a personal, but but recently I'm 53, and a year ago I was diagnosed with ADHD,
Mhm.
like just a year ago.
Yeah,
And 31 years ago, I was shot 5 times, and had PTSD, but was only really diagnosed with that like very recently because I didn't go to therapy, right?
sure.
And when you say, well, maybe because I didn't have those like I mean, apparently drinking and whatever,
Mhm.
but it showed up when my mother died,
Sure.
right? And so, but plus I had those other stuff, early on. So what I've learned is the differences between nice and kind. And then that whole like trauma response and ADHD. And I don't know if you're going to talk about some of those things and kind of like the chicken or the egg, like and kind of similar to the last question, right? So what happens first, right? And like, we're coping, but then there's things that I've learned that if you don't have boundaries and all this other stuff, that people talk about like self-care and all this stuff, that I guess that's the maladaptive coping thing that maybe I have or whatever, you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
if you can speak to that and especially late, you know,
Yeah.
onset or diagnosis or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for sharing and feeling, safe enough to be that vulnerable in this space. I appreciate that greatly. And yeah, so a lot of things that kind of sort of triggered in my head. Maladaptive, right? Not the greatest word in the world. So apologize if that was a little triggering or a little insensitive. Um, it is absolutely possible that we cope with whatever is given to us. The deck of cards that were dealt, right? And we cope with it for a very long time. And as you said, for your own personal experience, something triggered a response where you weren't able to cope anymore, where you needed to go seek that assistance, however you made that decision for yourself. That is absolutely a thing. One of those protective factors that we all have is our own resilience. And we all bring that genetically. We're born with some kind of presence, if you will, of resilience. So there are individuals who can go through very similar experiences, but not come to the place of feeling impaired or struggling. They're still coping. And then there's individuals who, again, can be triggered quite easily. You know, it's so varied. And like your chicken or egg question, if I had an answer to that, we wouldn't have a job. I wouldn't have a job. Anybody in this field wouldn't have a job. And the world would probably be lovely and beautiful. It's really hard. There's so many factors that go into someone who may express a mental condition or a mental illness or disorder, whatever you want to call it, that it's really hard to tease out. And we will talk some more about some other chicken or egg kind of questions as we come through. Yeah, did I speak to kind of your ask?
Yeah, and so and I think, for a very long time, oh, especially after like I survived like this gunshot, like, coma and losing my speech and whatever. So I was a felt like as a blessing, like kind of like a
Mhm.
survivor's guilt or whatever, right?
Mm.
But I often, even in early childhood, I didn't realize that I had a negative experience in early childhood. Like now my
Mhm.
therapist says that, I'm like, okay, well, it didn't really bother me, you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
it showed up like after I started working in government, because I have a strong social justice. But then like the being treated unfairly, sort
Mhm.
of, I didn't stand up for myself. That's kind of like, but it's taken me like 30 plus years to realize that those things, I can do something to prevent all those negative things with
Yeah.
this, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
those were some skills. And I guess that's, and yes, it was a little bit triggering them. I'm like, no, but I didn't do this or that or have a drinking, whatever. But it is some of those skills that I have learning to do now,
Yeah.
right? Where I witness other people. I was like, oh, wow. I would go up to them, like, how did you know how to stick up for yourself with? I was like, well, I do. And then that's like that trauma response. So I hope you're going to talk about that,
Yeah.
where I think, until you have to live it, like, oh, you know, that's what we're supposed to do to sort of, care about ourselves, right? So I don't want to, but that's like to talk about all this stuff because there's like a trauma, so much trauma,
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
all
So
the different kinds. And
we're
so,
we're going to get to trauma, and I will spend a lot of time talking again my personal belief system in addition to research, right? Is that trauma is underneath, it's the root underneath the expression of all mental illness. And the chicken or egg, we're never going to answer, but we can talk about it, we can philosophize. And we will. So yes, appreciate you.
thank you.
We will get to some trauma discussion. There was one other point I wanted to make, and poof, it went out of my brain. If it comes back, I'll share it. I see some comments. Holler at me if there's something important that I need to attend to, because I know we're also a little like time crunchy. And so I'm going to keep us rolling for the moment. Oopsie daisies. This cursor has been a problem for me today. Okay, so we think of mental health on a continuum. What I mean by that is the graphic you're looking at is a really very simple way, again, to look at it, right? We all want to be in the thriving and excelling zones, right? That's where we want to be, where we're like motivated. We feel healthy. We feel balanced. Somebody mentioned balance earlier. We are able to accomplish things. We're making progress towards our goals, right? We feel good. If we're honest, we're probably all more than likely, most often of our lives, spending time in the surviving zone, potentially even the struggling zone, right? We may have some anxieties. We may have trouble sleeping. We may have not the healthiest eating habits. We may have some maladaptive coping skills, whether that's something like smoking cigarettes or binge watching TV for 6 hours on a Saturday, right? Again, none of those are judgments, but though it works for some people and for some people it doesn't. It actually makes them a little bit less well. So we've all also probably been in crisis if we're all very honest with ourselves, right? It's hard to be honest about it because there is still so much stigma around mental health. I know I've been in crisis in my life. I'm sure again many of you have. That's where we're just not able to cope anymore. We don't have the resources. We're pouring from a beyond empty cup, and we're really kind of in a spiral at that moment. Again, all of the factors that we talked about impact our mental health, our social connectedness, our physical well-being, our work-life balance, all of these things, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about stigma. This is one of the things we're going to spend a bit of time talking about. Mental health isn't rare, right? If we were to count off fours in this room, like this statistic is suggesting that 1 in 4 individuals is diagnosed at some point in their lives with a mental illness. How many do we got in here? 43? We have at least 10 people who've been diagnosed. And I will say, right, that it's probably underreported. Like to Margarita's point, is that she had some life challenges and wasn't diagnosed until much later in life, right? And so there is this underreporting that happens. Now, we've come a long way with stigma. Mental health has been historically a bit of a barbaric practice, right? We've done a lot of wrong things, and we're still a very young and soft science. And though we've improved in a lot of ways, and there is more trainings like this or discussions or people being open and saying, I see a therapist, I struggled with depression, I had this traumatic experience, there's still a really long way to go around stigma. The problem with stigma is that it is one of the leading factors that prevents people from getting the support that they need. And when people don't get the support they need, a good kind of metaphor to think of is like a snowball rolling down the hill. It's just going to keep gathering more and more layers to have to break through eventually to get to the core of the issue so that person can kind of feel better and be resolved. We're going to watch a video, and I'm pretty sure I forgot to share my audio, so let me do that. Right. I will also give a bit of a trigger warning. I am an emotional human. I've seen this video probably 40+ times. I tend to get a little choked up. So if you fall on that spectrum of being an emotional human, where are my Pisces at? You might get a little choked up, and that's okay. I'll probably be choked up with you. Let me know if y'all can't hear the audio for some reason, but I'm going to give it a play.
You can be born perfectly rich, have a very good lifestyle, have parents who care very well for you. I don't think mental health issues discriminate against anyone of any race, gender, or social background.
Hi, nice
Hi.
to meet you. CHLC.
My name is Nicole. I'll be your moderator for this discussion.
I'm Nicholas. Today, I'm going to ask you a few questions about mental health in Singapore. What do you know about mental illness?
I just know there's depression.
Or
How do you say that? Bipolar disorder.
the wire is not so cute, you know?
This guy's crazy. Sound these kind of words.
That's nothing to do with me.
Would you hire somebody with mental health condition?
Or probably, make them work in a, admin side.
Simple, cleaning, or some simple job.
Either they hurt themselves or they're going to hurt someone else. Then if you have a mental illness, you apply for a job. But who in the right sense would really want to take you?
Would you date somebody who has a mental health condition? Some of them will get quite manipulative. They'd say like, if you break up with me, I'll cut myself or I'll kill myself.
And then sometimes they tend to post unreasonable things, such as like a small thing that happened, and then they'll make a big fuss out of it.
I cannot handle. I don't know how to handle.
How would you react to, a friend or family member who's diagnosed with mental illness?
The bridging needs to be the family and not a stranger.
不是专业医生，我们可能处理不了。
If possible, I would just stay away as far as possible.
这个笑最好是不要靠近他。
I didn't introduce myself fully. I suffer from clinical depression.
I was clinically diagnosed with depression. I'm living in recovery.
And I overcame it. I wrote a letter that I would like you to read out to me.
12 years is a long time to live with a mental health condition.
In the 12 years that have been diagnosed with depression,
This is what I've learned.
I've learned that the greatest battles we fight are the ones with ourselves.
I've learned that most conversation about employment and the moment I repeat my diagnosis I've learned that shame is something society teaches you.
I've learned how to say sorry for showing symptoms of my condition.
I've learned that friends can disappear and I will never hear from them again.
I've learned that family doesn't always know how to support you, no matter how much you need them.
I've learned that hope is a little voice that whispers maybe.
That recovery process.
I've learned that one small crack doesn't mean I'm broken.
I've learned that I have an illness, but this illness is not my identity.
Sorry that you're going through this. I'm so
Do you have any questions you want to ask me?
Okay. Any immediate reflections? How did that land for you?
That was great, and the letter that was written that the gentleman wrote was fantastic, or maybe they both wrote it. It was a combination of their two letters. It's great.
Yeah. You know, my personal favorite part of that video is the very first gentleman they show when the two interviewees disclose that they have struggled with mental health, and like the look on his face is terrified and so guilty. Thanks for sharing, Adam. How about anybody else? How did that land? I think one of the things about this video is that it does a very good job of capturing two types of stigma that I want to bring up. So there is the social stigma, which is kind of what we talked about, those negative stereotypes, what we saw in this video. Somebody has a mental illness, what kind of job could they do? They need to be a sweeper or a cleaner, something simple, right? And then the self-stigma comes in. Think of it like internalized homophobia, internalized racism. When we start to internally absorb what we are picking up from the world, whether that's society, whether that's our family and friends, culture, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with self-stigma is that it is really erases people's self-efficacy, their ability to feel like they're worthy, which is something that we all need as human beings. And that, of course, stops them from further going to seek the support that they might need, and creates that snowball that we talked about a little bit earlier.
I have like sort of a remark and sort of question,
Sure.
but right before the video, you said something like, maybe I can't quote this perfectly, but you said something about the trauma, that there's a trauma and regardless of something else. I can't remember what you said exactly, but I think, or maybe it was in the video, but I think that because of different cultures, that there are certain cultures that have a definite risk of increased trauma because of structural racism and discrimination. And particularly, there are cultures that really value community. And so when they're in a different country, whether they be immigrants or whatever, then that's not the value of that, new different culture. And so in being Latina, I facilitated like Latinas in mental health in Chicago at this like whatever thing for Latina or Latino whatever month or whatever. And it was very interesting because every single person that was Latina, it's kind of like the stigma. I mean, including myself, it's like you can just do it. Just go to work, just go to school, get good grades. And we're always like just doing, and it's like a coping mechanism for, right? But if we were with our own culture, we would take care of ourselves, right? And so that seems to be lacking in this culture, like, an overall, not in the space, of course, but so I do really think that like it's different. not that other folks don't, have, as an epidemiologist, I know that suicide mortality is highest among white males, period. You know what I mean? So it's not like it's not like it's only certain people, but that, if you can speak to that a little bit, because
I
it's
sure will. We're
slightly
gonna get to
different.
it. You're like a slide ahead every time, Margarita. You got it all on your brain. It's all coming. And we're definitely going to talk about culture and how that impacts how people deal, especially in the West, right? The West is a conglomeration. We're a melting pot. The United States, different places handle things differently. So we'll definitely get there. I saw a couple other hands. Sharon, can I call on you?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I thought the video was moving. And what I took away is like that saying, when people know better, they can do better. And like that the people who are educated about depression and mental illness in the video, then when they had that human connection,
Yeah.
they wanted to do better and were able to, at least in that moment, overcome those stigmatizing reactions to mental illness.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. Sneak peek is that empathy is the key of it all. Tammy, what's up?
Okay, so the movie talked about mental health stigmatism and the workplace. And I can understand why people are apprehensive for, to have individuals in the workplace with mental illness, but at the same time, there are plenty of people in there that have a mental illness. Mm-hmm. It's just that it really is, and I think they need to identify this and create means and ways to support the people that work for them. But also, people, like, I know someone they have been diagnosed and they've had episodes on the job. Mm-hmm, sure. And more than once, right? They had bipolar with aggression. Okay. So if you're how would they work? Because if they're in an environment, if they work in an environment that's hostile, there's poor management, they don't tend to their people, they trigger individuals like this. Yeah. And they lose their job. Or they lost their job, but what happened was that they were ushered in a room with 5 males over them, because that's just how expensive that was. Mm-hmm. And my question too is that Social Security and these organizations still insist that these people go to work. Sure.
You bring up a really big, juicy discussion, Tammy. Right? I can speak from my experience where I work in a field where we have individuals who identify as peers, people who have lived experience, who choose to go into this work to say, hey, I struggled with depression, I struggled with psychosis, I struggled with substance use, and I'm here to show you that it's possible to recover. And of course, right? This is that big conflict of West industrialization, capitalism, and like human needs and just innate things that are in us, right? Like community, like Margarita has mentioned, and some other folks have. And there is a balance. When someone is not well, right? When they're having, like you talked about, this person who had several episodes, was triggered. My priority for that individual is for them to find wellness before they find work. And that's a catch-22. Right? To your point exactly, Tammy, right? There's still Social Security. Right. No. You can go work. You don't need to take care of yourself right now. We're not going to solve the world today. I wish we could. But absolutely, I want to acknowledge that those are very, the Venn diagram of complication that it builds in this world is really quite complex. Yeah.
I agree. And like I said, this individual does receive benefits from Social Security. And of course, with Social Security, it is the shell game. Yeah. You may get it all, you may not get it all. And then they give you just enough and they take back from you. And then you have a mental illness. You go and apply for SNAP benefits and they tell you, oh, you make too much money on your Social Security. Yeah. But the money you give Social Security is not enough to pay the rent. I mean, it's just a vicious cycle.
It is a very vicious cycle. And to your point as well, Tammy, that is another part of the snowball. It's another layer of the snowball, right? We're actually going to switch gears to talking about some other barriers to care besides stigma. So I'm going to take the opportunity to get us there because I think this is going to tap into what a lot of folks have been coming up with, right? So in addition to the fact that stigma is one of the biggest barriers to care, to even be able to say, hey, I'm struggling, I need help. That is very hard words, I know for myself still to come out of my mouth. I'm sure for most of us, especially as individuals who are connected in some way, shape, or form to the helping profession, we have a very special problem around that. But in addition to stigma, there is also accessibility. So again, think about, does someone know where they need to go to get the care they might need? Do they have bus fare? Do they know which bus to take? If they're a parent, do they have childcare so that they can go address their specific needs? So accessibility is a real issue we need to consider. We're in Chicago, right? Still to this day, the South and West sides are underserved. Where most services needed, they're still underserved. And so accessibility comes into that factor as well. Along the same lines as insurance. I still haven't found a dentist, y'all, in like a year and a half because I don't want to deal with it. I just don't want to. And think about someone who is struggling with depression, with anxiety, with psychosis, trying to navigate this system to find the care they need. And then adding Tammy's layer of complexity on it. Some folks are on Medicaid, Medicare. Try finding a provider who's competent in your culture, who speaks your language, who you can look at and see yourself in. That doesn't happen very often for individuals who are on Medicaid, Medicare. It's even hard to do that when you have a nice Blue Cross Blue Shield PPO, right? This field is dominated by a lot of white folks, and it's good to see it growing in a different direction, but that is yet another barrier that prevents people from getting care. Denial, which for me really kind of dovetails with stigma, and some cultural things, right? Again, let's talk about a Latina or a Black culture where it's been a pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If there is a generational, a cultural, a societal trauma that has existed and people push through because that's a coping skill, right? And so it is very challenging for someone who lives in the West, in the United States, who is of a different culture, who's not of the white dominant pathological, medical, clinical kind of thing, to get to a place to say that I need help because their culture tells them something otherwise, right? Lack of mental health literacy, similar, right? Again, individuals who are not familiar with these systems because that's just not something that they were brought up in their family of origin, in their society, in their little cultural bubble, whatever that might be. And then distrust in the mental health. Again, I mentioned we've been barbaric. We've done some really bad things that overshadow a lot of times the good direction that we're moving in and all these systems that we have to navigate in. Even though we're all genuinely heart-centered, trying to move in the right direction, there's all these systems that are not heart-centered and that kind of pull us all back to this difficulty and create this distrust in this work. Any other barriers you all can think of or you want to speak to?
Zoya, I'm so glad. I've never seen this distrust in the mental health profession ever on a slide. And it's so important. And I know like Maureen was, I met her during the COVID, vaccine stuff. And this is a huge, huge, huge problem that we saw during COVID. And so especially like public health doesn't talk about this as much. Like it's a thing. So I'm glad it's being brought into this space. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yes, thank you. Anybody else want to share out? I've got one more kind of barrier that I want to talk about. And this is a good ring. Yeah.
I'd like to jump in. I'm gonna try to keep mine succinct. Just kind of piggybacking off of it's Margarita, right? Did I see your name right?
Yeah, that's it. That's
Okay,
it.
perfect. Yeah, just piggybacking off of what Margarita was saying about the lack of like trust in the mental health system. I'd like Journey to say like the general just like mental or the general like healthcare system here like in the US. There's like a lack of trust there. And then I wanted to kind of like double back into accessibility. I feel like what's really important to acknowledge too is like physiological disabilities that people struggle with that also can be like that also can coexist with like mental like issues that people struggle with. And I feel like that's like a really big thing in the city. I mean, just like randomly, I'm just thinking of like how few elevators we have like on the CTA. It's like, how many stops do you actually see elevators? Like if you're up north, it's like at least 3 stops before you see like an elevator. So that's just like one thing too.
Yeah, beautiful point, Kai. Thank you for bringing it up. That is an accessibility issue I hadn't considered. Absolutely, being able to the right again in the intersectionality of our beings, the fact that we have ability as one of the parts of ourselves, in addition to culture, gender, orientation, da 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 da. Yeah, it's important not to forget about that physical ability and how that could end up being a barrier when we aren't addressing those needs. Yeah. Awesome. Go ahead. I got a hand up.
Sure, perfect. Thank you. I think with the barriers, what I don't see is also language barrier. And because إذا بلشت أحكي معكم بالعربي رح تفهموا علي. And also being recognized as, you know, not in the wrong group, because as Arab Americans, we've always been, you know, put under white community, and our needs and our health and our care was never addressed. So with us at Arab American Family Services, I know that this year or last year we passed the MENA bill, but I hope that moving forward, people start recognizing, you know, along with the African American, along with the Latino community, the Arab American community, that there's about 450,000 in the state of Illinois, their needs will be addressed. And language, I think for a lot of us is a huge issue because there's not even enough counselors.
Yeah. Yeah.
In those communities to begin with. I mean, if the Latino community think they don't have enough, imagine the Arab and a Muslim community. So I just wanted to bring that up as a barrier to care as well.
Yeah,
and the misinformation and misunderstanding of providers. You know, I think this could be another whole presentation on just the lack of understanding that healthcare providers have and the stereotypes that they are, you know, following on, and how they shut down a client who's coming in for service, but tell them, well, that's part of your culture, which it's not. So I think there needs to be an education to healthcare providers and the trainings of healthcare providers.
Yeah, I will not argue with that at all. And thank you for bringing up your community into it. Absolutely. There are tons that get overlooked. And it's even evident, right? I'm bringing up kind of for really poor word choicing, the easy targets, right? But absolutely, there are other individuals and other cultures. We, as I mentioned, are a big pot of stuff. And, you know, we want to be connected, but we also need our groups and our kind of home base and all of those things. Those aren't getting adequately addressed in this system. That's for sure. Yeah, John.
Yeah, I was going to share as far as translation. There's a lot of disconnect between what happens with translation. I've had a few examples just recently of like the translator isn't translating appropriately. And so when you're dangerous enough to know the actual language and be like, that's not even what was said. So they're getting like an ad lib translation, or secondly, they're getting documentation back in English. I've had that happen where like my client's fully Spanish speaking or speaks another language. They had the appointment in that language, and then here comes the document that they need to understand their diagnosis in English. So then they have to request another appointment, or they have to get someone else to translate it. And that just doesn't make sense because you already knew that the language barrier existed. So I think mental health, you know, physical health, all these realms of healthcare need to get more advanced, and there's plenty of tools. So I don't see why there's the disconnect when there's plenty of tools and accessibility processes that can be put into play for people who have a different language.
Great point, Regina. Yep. I got one more hand up, Joanna.
Yeah, and I think this applies to all subgroups in this country. We don't have a social safety net. So to seek care, be it to take off an hour of work, some people cannot do that, let alone actually get a break in order to heal. You know, I mean, that's just, it's kind of unheard of at this point. I'm 60 years old. I remember growing up and people would say, it always sounded good to me, be careful or you'll get sent to the funny farm. And I thought, I like the idea of a funny farm, but we don't have that kind of a culture. I think it's tied to patriarchy and capitalism myself, but that's probably for a different presentation. So thanks.
I won't disagree with you, but it's nice to be in a room full of like-minded people. Kai, I'm going to call on you and then I'm going to move us along. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off of Joanna's point and what Regina was saying of like when Regina was like, you know, I don't understand why these things don't exist. And like Joanna says, like capitalism and just like the reality that our healthcare system is a business and not really built to actually help us.
Yeah, that is the sad truth. And again, I will give you the sneak peek. I'm not going to fix that for us in this remainder of the time we have together. You know, with the fact that we're all here and invested in these and having these conversations, it's the small changes that, you know, will hopefully eventually collect to something that's bigger. And I will step back and say, you know, step out of the pessimism for a second. It has gotten better. It has, right? Think of the 60s. It's gotten better. And so we can only get better, I hope. But again, with people like you all being present and doing these trainings and having these discussions, I have hope. So I guess that's something. Awesome. I'm trying to be mindful of time. We've got, I think, about 45 minutes. Maureen, if you can keep me, I don't know, abreast, that would be super helpful. But I'm going to keep us going. So the last barrier to care I want to talk about is substance use. This is a endless chicken or egg question. I can think of several individuals I've worked with who started using substances recreationally, experimentally as kids, and maybe they had that genetic predisposition to get triggered by something like that, and ended up developing an addiction, a substance use disorder, which inherently is traumatic and can then cause mental health challenges. And I've certainly worked with tons of individuals who organically, right, have expressed mental illness because of, again, the genetic predisposition, life experiences, and started using substances to cope, to regulate that situation. The thing about mental health and substance use is they work very much like comorbid medical conditions. Like COPD will worsen your heart disease. Your heart disease will worsen your COPD, et cetera, et cetera. And these work the very same way. Someone might be using more substances when they're struggling with more symptoms, and that might create more symptoms, where someone might be having more symptoms and then using more substances to manage, but their mental health might increase, right? So on and so forth. So we really want to try to approach these comorbidly at the same time, concurrently, and be also really wary and mindful around the stigma associated with substance use. If we've made some progress around stigma with mental illness, we've made less progress with stigma around substance use. It is still a very stigmatized psychiatric diagnosis. You know, a lot of people tend to think, oh, get a job, bum, you know, it's your fault that you're using. You should just, again, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing. And so being really mindful that there's this additional layer of stigma on top of individuals who are struggling with both substance use and mental health. We are going to get into talking about trauma. So let's switch gears and get there. My personal 2 cents, again, and I do think research shows this, is that underneath any expression of a mental health or a substance use diagnosis is some kind of trauma. Trauma is incredibly individualized, just like each and every one of us are. What can be traumatic to one individual may not be traumatic to another. And so one thing I like to say is always when someone is expressing something that they are saying was traumatic, they are the expert on their lives. We're not there to judge or to say yes or no to that. We are there, again, to be that empathetic listener, to be that empathetic support and that human connection. Other things about trauma is trauma can stem from one incident, one occurrence. I worked with an individual who had been in a very bad car accident and really struggled being in a car afterwards. They had a traumatic response to being in a car. Or trauma can be many small traumas or big traumas compiled onto one, right? So think of child sexual abuse and a child who's consistently molested for several years, or living with a parent who is in and out of jail and that caretaker disruption that can happen. So trauma is, again, very broad. We're certainly not going to cover every aspect of it. But what's really important about it, just like our mental health is how we think, feel, see, perceive the world, trauma is like, think of them of like glasses. They could be rose-colored, they could be really dark, murky, and you can't see straight out of them. And so that's what trauma does, is it's another lens that comes over our eyes through which we see the world, and that's why it impacts everything that we do within the world, right? The good thing is that you don't have to be a clinician or a, you know, social worker or anything like that to practice the tenets of trauma-informed care. So this is something we can all take in our pockets and utilize in our day-to-day interactions, whether they're at work or whether they're in the community. If we can provide folks with safety, that's both physical safety, so that might be a little bit of space. For some folks, it might be a hand on the hand, right? If we can provide them with emotional safety, and what I really mean by that is a non-judgmental atmosphere in which they can connect with you, speak with you, share their truth. If we can be trustworthy. If you think of trauma, inherently trauma is a breach of trust. That is like one of the core roots of a traumatic experience. It has broken that person's trust for a specific individual or a specific aspect of the world. I think of like the car, like that individual did not trust being in a car, right? So if we can provide trust by being clear, doing what we say and saying what we do, and being clear in our boundaries and limitations, that sometimes gets overlooked. There are things we can't do, like we can't solve the world today, y'all. That's my boundary and limitation for today. You might be working with someone who's unhoused and being like, I need housing tomorrow. We want to be honest. We want to be trustworthy and say, I cannot make that happen. But what I can do is da 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 da, right? So we can provide that safety and trustworthiness with those boundaries, offer choice. Choice can be as simple as someone is in a crisis situation and saying, I've got a hot cup of coffee and a cold bottle of water. Which one would you prefer right now? Would you like to speak where we are talking right now, or would you like to go into a private office? What that does when we offer that choice is that it starts to bring people's prefrontal cortex back online and kind of out of the emotional brain, and gives them a moment to pause, think, have some empowerment to make a choice for themselves in that moment, and likely start to de-escalate. So safety, trustworthiness, choice. If we genuinely collaborate with that individual and again, provide that ability for their own empowerment, how do you want to see the situation resolve? Bearing in mind that we might have limits that we have to attest to, but genuinely collaborating with them, letting them speak their truth and their voice, and supporting them however you can to accomplish and resolve the situation the way they're saying it's going to resolve for them. We're really providing that trauma-informed care. The cool thing about trauma-informed care is it's really beneficial for the folks that you're dealing with, that you're working with. It's also very helpful for you. It supports your own boundaries. It supports, again, not de-escalating a situation where it's not in such a crisis state, which is always stressful, whether we're good at dealing with a crisis or not, they're stressful regardless. And so this is something that, again, we can kind of take with us and implement into our daily existence. Any questions about trauma-informed care? Boundaries are everything.
Yeah, I just had, a comment because we do trauma-informed care here at the city, but the word empowerment is sort of like this, like, power, what's it called? It's like, somebody's giving, the power to somebody else to, empower them. Like I prefer like agency, right? So like people have strengths. So I think that's really important, but like the way we describe it, I think it's slightly different, and it could be very strength based if we look at it in a different perspective. That's all.
Okay, yeah, so it's
Like
more
very, yeah. Well, I've heard because I used to use the term, and it's just like, and then over and over in the last probably like 10 years, like, yeah, this like word empowerment and empower people and then communities impact, like it's kind of like but so it's kind of this agency is a different way to sort of highlight the strengths that people already have. They're just like, yeah.
Yeah, good reframe. Kai.
I wanted to piggyback off of that from Margarita's reframe of does like autonomy feel good, Margarita? That's what I thought of when you were saying agency.
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah. It's like uncovering that, helping folks like uncover their own autonomy or agency, because maybe nobody taught them how to use the boundaries. I'm laughing because I'm starting to, after 50, learning what that is.
Again, better late than never, I would say. Yeah, totally. Again, I think the concept is still underneath the same, right? We are supporting people in being their truth, right? And again, historically that's not necessarily been the case in mental health. We've locked people away, we've medicated people, we're like, you're a nuisance, please go away, and this is what we're going to do. And in this situation, it's really, again, listening and having that human empathy, and that everybody has something like a value to contribute. Everybody does. right? We learn from all of these experiences. And so that can be a very central focus that we take as well. Awesome. Okay, we're gonna switch gears. This section I tend to fly by, and especially because I think we're done at 1:30 if I'm not mistaken. Good, thank you. Well, I'm just probably going to shoot by it, but again, always feel free to reach out and ask questions if they do come up, or thoughts and reflections. So we're going to talk about these diagnoses, really basic 101 stuff. Major depressive disorder, right? We've all been depressed. We've all woke up sad for some reason. It could be situational. You lost a loved one and you're grieving, and that's causing some depression. I don't know, it's Chicago and it's winter and you haven't seen the sun in 4 weeks and it's 4 degrees. That's kind of depressing for me personally. And so we all know what that feeling is. Again, it's a very broad presentation. So people can have very mild depression, where you're just kind of generally lethargic, kind of sad. You're not sure what it's about. You're not sure what's going on, but they're just feeling down a lot. To very severe, where someone is not getting out of bed, not able to meet their daily needs, from food to hygiene to paying bills, going to work, whatever it might be for them, right? At the very, very extreme, we might see suicidal ideation, someone feeling so hopeless and unable to envision continuing that they're considering suicide. Again, just to highlight the same thing with everything, don't be an armchair psychiatrist. We all struggle with this. This is actually a natural part of the human emotional spectrum. I know my life have struggled with sadness and have always been like, no, I'm not going to be sad. Go the hell away, sadness, go away. Like, and learning to accept that that is a normal process of the human emotional spectrum has been challenging for myself, and I think probably for a lot of us. But when that person is struggling, ongoing, persistent, pervasive, or is at a very severe impairment, that's when we start to consider a diagnosis. Some other things you might see are like literally a physical slowing down, a lethargy. Someone is really so depressed that they're unable to get themselves to run to a bus. They're just kind of dragging their body around. Again, we might see the difficulty concentrating. We might see ruminating thoughts. They might look like they're not really with us because they're so stuck in their brains. I'm going to keep us moving so we can get to some of the de-escalation stuff. So anxiety disorders, again, anxiety is a normal human response. And when we were living in tribes, when we were living on the land and in that kind of community, it was a protective response for us. We saw a tiger, we ran, we survived, right? Nowadays, unfortunately, we still have the same exact brain structure that we had when we were more primitive Homo sapiens, and it still gets triggered. And now it gets triggered by like deadlines, and it gets triggered by like, I need to go to the grocery store and pick up my kid, but that's happening at the same time. So when anxiety becomes, again, this chronic problem for an individual, they can't settle down that nervous system. That's really when we're looking at a diagnosis. Once again, the range is going to be wild, right? There's going to be people who are just generally anxious, who have a tough time sleeping. They can't tell you what they're anxious about, but they just feel a little bit of unsettlement. And then we're going to have individuals who are going into full-blown panic attacks, somatic symptoms, complaining of chronic headaches, stomach aches, joint pain. All of these things can be an expression of anxiety. Oh, I do think somebody, right, in general, we've talked a little bit about healthcare. One of the first places that someone with anxiety or depression goes for support is their primary care doctor. Maybe it was Joanna who was talking about, again, no, it was Itadella? Correct me when I'm wrong, please. Talking about how providers need to be educated, right? Because we go in and we say, I got chronic stomach aches. What do you get? Propranolol, right? You don't get the questions surrounding around maybe what's going on underneath that. So I think that's an important thing to know. Yeah, Maureen.
Yeah, just super quick. I just want to share my own experience with this, and I think it touches on so many of the barriers. It's especially true for poor people, that the first place you go is your primary care doctor. And many of these clinics, that serve marginalized communities and poor communities, sadly, are sometimes get the newest PCP, or the PCP with the least experience, or the most overworked one. So I had an experience in my life where I went to such a clinic, a Medicaid clinic, and I was struggling with depression. I was feeling really down. I was having trouble. I was really hoping to get some help. And when I went in, I said, I feel very depressed. This doctor was like, oh no, you're not depressed because you're wearing makeup and you brushed your hair. And if you were really depressed, you wouldn't be able to do that. So basically, like, only acknowledging the people you spoke of, that one spectrum where you can't get out of bed.
Yeah.
But like,
Yeah.
that is something that I feel like a well-trained therapist or psychologist would never dream of saying, but this doctor did.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Maureen. I'm sorry that that was an experience, and the reality is that so many people experience that, right? In the work that our staff do on a daily basis, that is the population we serve, the most marginalized of the most marginalized in all cultures, right? It's that poverty, that's that other layer that kind of overshadows every aspect of that a person's ability to get to a place of wellness. Yeah, thank you. What else about anxiety
I
disorder?
have a question about, well, not a question, I mean, kind of, so is this, when I hear like PhDs in psychology talk about anxiety specifically, and then anxiety among like young people, and like you express like this anxiety is like a normal reaction to stress. However, when it's talked about, is that sort of emotional dysregulation that like that the person who's experiences doesn't want to like let that go or sit with it and kind of wants to fight it, and then there's just like it's just the worry just becomes overwhelming, you know what I mean, or because that person just it's just too much, you know, like, and it's just like built up, or is it like something different?
So I'm not sure I understand the full question. In general, right, anxiety can manifest in, again, so many very different ways. One thing that if I haven't mentioned or haven't made clear enough is that it's impairment to that individual, right? So again,
Okay.
there might be a baseline of
Okay.
your being is and functions, and as long as you feel okay, you're not identifying it as a problem for yourself, more than likely it's not. More than likely, right? It might be, and you might eventually get to a place where you decide to seek some support around it or ask some questions or do some self-exploration, right? It doesn't always involve a therapist or medications or something. Like people can really, again, rely on their communities or their own coping skills or their own resiliency, so on and so forth. But for sure in the DSM, again, if we're looking at diagnosis, one of the criteria is that it is distressful to that individual. So it is really
Yeah.
identifying that this is
Yeah,
not
yeah. I guess what I'm saying is like I guess there's things that are not you know, folks that, you know, having because this anxiety and depression are like one of the most
yes, yeah,
you know, prevalent, you know, with mental health. But but there's like some coping skills that one could have, you know, that may mitigate sort of the, you know, disrupting the normal behavior, you know, like going to school or the work or like whatever. So I guess that emotional regulation is that something in that, you know, where it becomes just disruptive, is that's where it kind of goes that the person just is just, you know,
yeah, I would say whenever I reach a threshold for they are, again, going back to our definition, right? Not being able to cope with regular stress, not, you know, functioning, having that functional impairment where they are, like think of a straight A student, right? Let's take a look at this teen example, because it is a very prevalent, especially since the pandemic in teenagers, to have anxiety and depression. And we're learning more about it. And so it's more talked about and, you know, more uncovered, if you will, so on and so forth. But there's tons of kids who go through school and they have an anxious situation, they fail a test and they bounce back. And there's those folks who don't. And again, those are all those factors are going to implement. And that's where, yeah, they can reach that overwhelm and kind of fall into a diagnosis, that pervasive and persistent pattern of continuously responding to what we might think as a minor stressor as a very severe stressor. That's how their body is processing it.
okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to jump along to psychosis. So psychosis is in itself not a diagnosis. It is a syndrome or a condition, you might think of it as, that really the root of is a disconnection from reality. This typically happens in kind of two very clear symptomologies, one being delusions or fixed beliefs that aren't grounded in reality, and one being hallucinations or the somatic experience of a sense that, again, no one else can seem to see or identify or confirm. Interesting thing about hallucinations that maybe not everybody knows is that every one of our senses, so smell, touch, sight, taste, I forget what our senses are, hearing, we can all experience hallucinations per each of those different senses. So someone can have tactile hallucinations and feel like something is touching them when it might not be, gustatory, taste hallucinations, olfactory, smell, etc., in addition to the more commonly known visual and auditory. One thing about delusions I like to point out is that fixed belief kind of thing. It really is. I've worked with individuals who, through many years, have consistently told me the same, not grounded in reality, truth for themselves. It doesn't change. It's not like I'd come in one day and be like, the aliens are out to get me, and tomorrow I'd be like, I am God, and the third day I'd be something else, right? It's a very fixed, over time belief. I find it really interesting that in my experience, there's almost always a nugget, a kernel of truth underneath that person's fixed delusional belief. And so again, we really want to be mindful about taking the truth as the truth. What I mean by that is if we're working with someone who's experiencing psychosis actively and saying, the aliens are coming to get me, I'm so terrified, don't you see the aliens? We're not saying, oh, of course I see the aliens. Yes, they're coming out to get you, but we can identify with the feeling that person is experiencing. Joe, that sounds terrifying. Let's sit down and talk about it some more, right? We can feel that emotion and validate the emotion and not the content. Does that make sense? And that's often a useful tool. Any other questions about psychosis? Because I'm gonna try to zip by here. All right. I will also send you this deck, y'all, so you'll be able to reference back and read it through and all of those things. So bipolar disorder is a mood disorder. I think that's also kind of a lesser known fact, because it affects people's moods. This is another great chicken or egg situation. I think in general, bipolar disorder is severely overdiagnosed because a lot of individuals who are diagnosed with bipolar disorder are also struggling with substance use. And so bipolar disorder is the spectrums. People will go through periods of depression. We talked about what that looks like. And then they'll go into periods of mania, which is a heightened state of anxiety. So mania can come with a disconnection from reality. People may have impaired judgment. They may feel very grandiose. They may, again, believe they're on a special mission or something of that sort. And it can really put them in really risky, dangerous situations. Now, the challenge with mania is that most people who are manic enjoy being manic. It feels good. And it's really difficult to kind of help them see the negative consequences that manic behavior and those manic episodes may be causing them. Again, very broad range of presentation. It can be anything from really long depression periods to a very quick manic period. People can oscillate a lot more rapidly. People can have a longer manic period and then a shorter crash, so on and so forth. And why I say it's overdiagnosed, right? Think of someone using crack cocaine. When the drug is in their system, they're going to present in a manic state. That's typically what it looks like. And then once they come off of when they're going through withdrawal, they crash into the depression. And so there is really just a factor to consider around bipolar disorder that asking some questions if there is some comorbid substance use, because again, we really want to try to treat those together. Okay, last diagnosis we're going to talk about is post-traumatic stress disorder, and then we're going to talk a little bit about de-escalation and try to wrap up with self-care in the last 20-some minutes we've got here. So post-traumatic stress disorder, as we chatted, can be triggered by a single event or by multiple events. Historically, PTSD has been, and I'm talking like 60s, 70s, was originally created, if you will, for veterans and the war experience. This is no longer the only category. Any traumatic event can trigger symptoms of PTSD, which typically present in one of these three categories or multiple at the same time. So people might re-experience. That might be like nightmares or flashbacks, re-experiencing the traumatic event, sort of dissociating from reality and being in it in the moment. We might see avoidance. So this person might look kind of depressed. They might isolate, they might withdraw, they might actively avoid talking about their traumatic experiences or any triggers to their traumatic experience. And we might see someone in hyperarousal, which kind of can look like mania or anxiety, someone who is having a hard time sitting still, who, when they enter a room, needs to sit with their back to the corners and be able to see the door. We might see angry outbursts from individuals who are having a trauma response in a hyperarousal kind of presentation. Other thing about trauma, and I think we know this, right? It's disproportionately common in individuals who are struggling with mental illness. And because I do think that that is often the root behind the expression of mental illness. Any quick questions about that? Otherwise, we'll hop over to talking about de-escalation.
Yeah, I just want to, kind of raise the concern about like violence in this, with, police involvement, which, unfortunately, it's just happening, more often. Um, but there's a need for like a crisis response or stuff like that, because that like that angry or that like that and edge when people are always like, looking for, threats in their world, right? And so I don't know, just it seems to be coming up a lot more.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, right? This is the root of the George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, is that right? Yeah, we still don't do great in a lot of different areas. Oh, I lost what I was gonna say. We're gonna talk about something that's going to be pertinent to that shortly. But yes, it is. Oh yes, I'm gonna provide some resources. Woof, there it is. I'm gonna provide some resources that I think would be beneficial, because there is a growing modality, if you all haven't heard about it, of mobile crisis response teams. And so we'll talk about that as we start to wrap up. Okay. This is a super abbreviated and simplified model of what de-escalation can look like. Generally speaking, we want to engage with someone. If we walk into a crisis, if we see a crisis developing, we want to go have that engagement, that human connection, that empathy, right? Then we're going to work into de-escalation, which we're going to talk about shortly. Once that person is de-escalated, and not a second before, we can talk about problem solving. And then after we figure out a solution or a potential solution or a tentative solution, we can start talking about follow-up care or seeking support, whether that's for that individual who needs some wraparound services or for yourself as the person who navigated through that crisis. Has anybody heard of the term time horizon? Give me a raise of hand. Okay, I've got a couple. Yeah, it was super new to me. I had never heard about this until we started creating this deck. Adam, what's up? Oh, is that a hand raise for time horizon?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I can only see 6 people. I don't know why my Zoom is being weird, but thank you for raising your hand and shouting out. So, what is a time horizon? Every single one of us in this room, every human has a time horizon. It's how far we can think into the future. So again, raise a hands just for funsies that I can't see most of you all. Who's thought about this weekend? Probably all of us, right? You all maybe can attest if you can see more people. Have you thought about your next vacation? So the Maureen was like shooting up there. Yep. Have we thought about retirement? The people I see on the screen have. I haven't really, but that's, that just shows where our time horizons are, right? So that's what that is. What's important about time horizon for someone who's experiencing mental health challenges, symptoms, or in crisis is that their time horizon is drastically shortened. So while we can think that far in advance on a good day, on a given day, right? That person cannot think or see past that immediate need. Super easy example just for digestibility. There's a homeless individual who consistently goes to Starbucks on the corner, right? And sometimes the Starbucks employees or people in there will help out and get a sandwich or a coffee or something or other. And today, for some reason, they're walking around and asking for support and people are getting irritated, right? And so the manager comes out and says, "Hey, Joe, I know sometimes we give you a sandwich and a coffee. Today we can't. I need you to leave." And Joe is just hungry and tired and needs some love and support and says, "Just give me a sandwich and I'll go." And manager decides to stand firm on it for this day and say, "We cannot. I need you to go." Joe gets escalated and he's pacing and he's making people uncomfortable and so on and so forth. So the manager says, "I need you to leave and you can't come back today." Joe's not getting it. "Okay, I need you to leave and you can't come back for a week, Joe." Joe's still not getting it. So that we keep setting this limit beyond this person's time horizon, and we have to step back, or we can step back with this knowledge now and understand that he literally cannot see past this immediate need. He does not understand that his future self is being consequenced, and consequently your consequences, your limits are not being helpful. They're in fact escalating the situation. What questions about how you all can take time horizon and utilize it?
So,
Yeah.
could you just quickly give an example, like in the example you just gave, is what would see what you're saying that it was not helpful to be like, you can't come
Sure.
back today, you can't come back in a week.
Yeah.
I feel like give the guy a sandwich.
Yeah.
But other than that, what would be like with this time horizon, like what would be the good way? Is there a
Got
way
it.
to like stay in the immediate with that gentleman?
So when we run into that situation, what we're going to do is engage in de-escalation, right? So let's talk about what that could look like. Now, this isn't going to work every single time, right? This isn't going to work for everybody. But I genuinely believe when we can have enough space and time to practice this to this length that that person needs, we will de-escalate them. And sometimes we just don't have that time in this world, right? So if we had all the time in the world and we really had the ability to spend with them as they process through us, de-escalation would always work. But it doesn't always. So that's my caveat, I guess. But again, engage. We want to introduce ourselves. If I walked into that situation, I was the manager. I know Joe in that situation. Hey, Joe, I see maybe, you know, I know we sometimes do this thing. We give you a sandwich. I'm so sorry today we can't. We let people vent sometimes, right? That is okay. There is a limit. There's a difference between someone pacing and walking around and scrunching a water bottle that they have and picking up a cup and looking like they're going to throw it at you, right? And so we want to let people have the space to vent as long as it's safe, people around them are safe, etc. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just thinking like I'm totally agreeing with Maureen, but like what about something that you said before, like choices that isn't not very immediate? Like, you know, there are some food pantries and other things that are not going to be like right there in front of them right now, but maybe like listening, like, you know, I hear you're really frustrated, right? But there are these resources. It might be for a few hours or tonight, then you can go to this place, or I don't know, like I don't, is that an option? Like,
yeah, I would say that is both choice and also a bit of problem solving. And I wouldn't get there yet, right? So Joe's still
okay. Oh, okay.
limits. I'm letting him vent. I'm affirming and saying, okay, I hear that is very frustrating, Joe. If I was in that situation, I'd also be frustrated. Or again, you have to find your own vernacular. I say heard a lot. That's just a thing that's in my vernacular for whatever reason. And so whatever you affirm, right? We're letting them vent. We're showing that we're with them. We're listening. We're being present. We're asking for more information. We can ask open-ended questions, which are really helpful. Not necessarily in this crisis situation, but in any crisis situation, like, and tell me more about that. And then what happened, right? We're eliciting information for ourselves to start problem solving, and we're letting that person get that emotional energy out, right? And I acknowledge not everybody's comfortable. I was at a shelter doing an MHAT session a bit, and he's like, I don't want people yelling at me and saying, you know, curse words at me and calling me derogatory terms. And that's a decision we all have to make for ourselves. Sometimes we got to go tag out, team member, you got to tag in this situation. That's totally appropriate. Once Joe is at a place where we sense that he is slightly de-escalated, we can start offering things like choice. Like, Joe, if you bring your vocal tone down, I can sit at this table with you and have a discussion, or we can step outside, right? And we're already starting to get to a de-escalation where we can start talking about problem solving. Like, hey, I know a pantry down the street. I know it's open tonight. I just happen to know that. You know, is that something you're willing to do? Because today we just can't give you a sandwich for whatever reason. One thing I'll say to Maureen's point, when we do set a limit, we don't want to go back on that limit, because then that individual is going to know that they can come in, whatever the situation is, get to this escalated state and get what they asked for. And so that's where, again, that idea of alternate choice, of letting the person vent, of being present with them, engaging in them in that manner until they're at a calm place so that we can start problem solving. As it says on the screen, not a time to disagree. I think of, again, another kind of easy to digest situation, maybe in a congregate living situation, like a shelter. Joe says, Tim stole my phone. We don't know if Tim stole the phone. We don't know if Joe lost it. We don't know if he sold it. We don't know, right? And so I'm not saying, Jim, whoever it is, Jim, Tom didn't steal your phone, so on and so forth. It's not a time to argue or disagree. It's a time to hear that person's truth. 99% of the time, in my experience, hearing a person's truth will de-escalate them. There is definitely a factor of sometimes needing to tap out. If you are the person that that person's upset with, they're not going to de-escalate, right? And so that's where we say, you know what, let me go get Carol, who I think you have a really good relationship with, and bring her into this conversation, and you just back the hell up and you let it happen. You don't take it personally. You understand that that person needs that at the moment. Once we get to the point, yeah.
I'm sorry. I just want to let you know that we have about 6 more minutes.
Okay. We're going to fly through. And again, I'll send you the deck, and I'm happy to stick around for questions, comments, or concerns or whatever. It's your all's time. I want to be mindful. I know this is kind of a lunch sort of situation, right? So once we get to the de-escalation, like I said, not a moment before, we want to talk about how do you see this resolving? How do you see this ending? Minding everything we've talked about. No, I can't get you. No, I can't give you a sandwich today, but here's what I can. Offering that choice, finding that collaborative approach, offering them agency, to Margarita and Kai's point, and finding what it is that's going to help them solve the problem. I'm just going to skip this slide because it's sort of, we've already chatted about it and you all can read through it later. I'm going to talk a little bit about some resources. I know not everybody is here in Illinois. So I'll try to tailor this as best as I can. Has everybody heard of NAMI, or anybody not heard of NAMI? I see mostly head nods. So NAMI is national wide, right? So wherever you are, if you go to NAMI, search NAMI in the Google, you'll find kind of your local chapters. They do a lot. They offer support to people who are struggling, to family members, like peer support, family support. They do a lot of different peer programming, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all different things that you can either, again, refer people you're working with. They can be utilized for yourself. They can be utilized for family. A great supportive organization. I want to spend some time talking about 988. Again, this is probably going to vary from state to state. 988 is a movement towards rebranding the National Suicide Hotline Prevention. So again, this is a national service, but what the change is the number is now 988. So what's nice is that you can think of it, if it's a mental health emergency, we want to call 988 first, with some exceptions that we'll talk about in a quick second. Now, again, I have heard the feedback that if you're in a different state, 988 will not work. You might have to do a little digging on what that actual number would be, or if you have to enter an area code before you call 988. But I know the goal is to move towards it being this nationwide mental health emergency dispatching system. So someone can both talk to someone if they're feeling suicidal and need some support, or if you are walking down the street and you see a member in the community who appears to be struggling with mental health challenges, and is not at imminent risk, so they don't have a weapon, they're not immediately presenting as they're going to harm someone else or harm themselves, you can call 988 and they'll dispatch a mobile crisis team from the general area to come talk with that individual, support that individual, get them to whatever care or supports they might need. Oh, 988 works in Texas. Awesome. I've heard mixed reviews, whether it does or doesn't. And so appreciate that it's good to know that in Texas it works. Other states, please let us know. We have a fax team. We serve only the north side of Chicago. So if you're not on the north side of Chicago, we wouldn't be called, which makes sense, right? It's a crisis. It's an emergency. We need someone closer to the, geographical region of the crisis to respond. But the main facts I want you to take away here, again, if it's a medical emergency, if there's a weapon involved, if it's an immediate risk to safety, that imminent risk of harm, that's not a 988 call, that's a 911 call. If it's not imminent risk, if it's not a medical emergency and the person's just in mental health distress, 988 is a great way to start getting that person some support. Any questions about resources? Because we are thankfully moving towards the end, and I'm going to kind of, yeah, go ahead.
Really quick. So yeah, I have a friend who's got, she gets services at Trilogy. You guys are great. She's talked about a warm line versus a hotline. Would that be the Trilogy number?
So there are many warm lines.
Okay.
Again, going to depend from state to state, place to place. Warm lines are kind of, well, the way I think about it is someone who just needs to talk to someone, but is not in a crisis. That's the difference between warm and hot. Hotline is I'm in a crisis, I'm feeling like I might hurt myself or someone else, versus warm line is I'm lonely and sad and I need some support, or I'm feeling anxious about something and I don't know how to manage it.
Thank you.
Yeah, great thing to bring up. Okay, last couple things. I'm gonna zip through literally in a minute. Vicarious trauma. These things can happen to us. They do happen to us. When we experience stories of trauma over and over again, sometimes we ourselves can develop a trauma response. That's what vicarious trauma is. Versus compassion fatigue, that's sort of more of the burnout of that empathy that we have, right? Especially if we're in the helping profession, we typically come here because we have a lot of empathy. We want to support people. And so it's really challenging when we enter this compassion fatigue, we find we don't have the empathy that we had when we came into the work. When this happens, this is self-care. A lot of people at this point ask me, well, what do I do? I cannot tell you. It's you. You got to figure it out for yourself. I'm a nature girl. If I don't spend time outside, I know I'm a little off base. Like I'm physically affected by it. I'm mentally affected by it. So going back to this idea of the continuum that we are all on, when we're in the green zone, this is a time for you to pause and reflect. What am I doing that's working for me? I'm eating a healthy diet. I am hanging out with my friends. I am doing the sport that I love, whatever it is. I'm doing spa day. I am meeting up and doing breakfast on Saturdays with my friends, whatever it is. We take note because when we end up in the orange zone, that's where we're using those skills as coping to get back to the green zone, right? Make sense? And then when we eventually end up in the crisis zone, which we all at some point probably will again, this is where we're not coping, but we're using those coping skills to get through the crisis so that we can get back to this place where we're okay and then start to implement additional supports and coping skills so we can get back to that thriving and excelling green zone where we all deeply dream of being every day. At least I do. That is all I have for you. I'm so sorry I had to fly through that towards the end. Thank you very much for your questions and participation. I will ask you all to please complete this survey. I'm not going to force anybody. It's 4 questions. It'll take you a minute. We are doing this free for whoever wants it because it's a grant from SAMHSA. And so this is data that I have to provide back to SAMHSA. Otherwise, I am here to hang out. If anybody has questions, thoughts, or reflections, shoot.
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, so this has been, thank you so much. Like, I will definitely reach out. You're just amazing because I work in public health at the health department in behavioral health, mental health. So have you done some work, you or Trilogy, in the space of work, like this sort of like, well-being at work and trauma and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Like
So for
real,
sure.
so
We definitely are a trauma-informed agency. We really try to practice that. Are we perfect? Absolutely not. One of the recent sort of general discussions has really been a deep focus on employee retention, and consequently that means well-being, right? There's a lot of different incentives over at Trilogy. We are considering, bless my heart, a 4-day work week, which would be amazing. And so, yeah, there's so many different incentives here, specifically for our staff, right? It's not like we're researching outside of the scope, but we want folks to be healthy.
I didn't mean that. I'm asking you if you or someone in Trilogy goes out to like a workplace and helps sort of build that. I wasn't like,
got you.
Because we're in
makes a lot
need
more
of
sense,
that.
but Trilogy is great. No, this right now is the only type of external training we're providing. So most of my team's job is to train our staff, is to provide them with their onboarding and corrective and ongoing CEU education and stuff like that. This currently is the only thing that I will go out to the community and provide to different places. Sorry, I misunderstood that.
So I'm really sorry, but I'm not really sure how to use this. Do you have to, I don't know what to do with.
Oh, sure, the QR code, yeah. So you need your phone and put it on the.
So I have to use my phone.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Put it on the camera setting, and then you pretend to take a picture of it, but you don't take a picture.
Okay. Yeah, I purposely leave my phone away so I can be fully present in this wonderful.
I appreciate that. Like I said, I will send you all the deck. Don't feel pressured. I mean, it helps me to get this data in, but I understand if it's like slips your mind, no big deal, right? We're not in school. You're not going to get an F if you don't do this the survey. So don't worry about it too much. I will send the deck to everybody. Maureen's going to get me everybody's emails, and I'll send you also 2 additional flyers just to kind of use as needed, right? None of this is proprietary information. If anybody is interested in bringing this to this agency, I love running these sessions, especially when we have such a great group of participants. So feel free to, you can reach out to, oh, where is that other? Oh, yes, right here. mhat@trilogyinc.org. Fairly easy to remember. That's a good place to, you'll reach me directly. And then if you'd like to set something up, we sure can.